Most people carry a quiet belief that life only moves forward when they keep acting, controlling, and forcing outcomes to match their plans. We hold tightly to relationships, push hard against career paths, and try to bend circumstances until they match exactly what we imagined. Yet the more a person pushes, the heavier everything begins to feel, almost as if life itself were quietly resisting every effort. Carl Jung believed that behind this constant pushing sits the ego, the part of the mind that always craves certainty and control above almost everything else. But beneath the ego, according to Jung, exists a much deeper layer of the psyche, a place where intuition and something many traditions call divine guidance quietly continue operating. In this video, we will explore why sometimes the wisest thing a person can do is not try harder, but stop long enough to let that deeper current finally lead the way. Number 1. The illusion that action equals safety. Most people grow up believing something so familiar that they rarely question it directly at all. When a problem appears, the instinct says we must do something about it immediately and without delay. If a relationship starts cracking, we talk more, explain more, and try harder to repair whatever feels broken. If a career path grows unclear, we rush toward a new plan, a new goal, or a completely new strategy. If anxiety quietly rises inside us, we immediately reach for action to smother that uncomfortable feeling. Inside the mind of the ego, action becomes equal to safety, almost without exception in daily life. Doing something, whether that something is wise or misguided, still creates the feeling that we remain in control. But from the perspective of analytical psychology, this belief is actually one of the deepest illusions people carry. Carl Jung once made a statement that captures this pattern with remarkable clarity, even many decades after he first wrote it down. He said that people will do anything, no matter how absurd, in order to avoid facing their own soul directly. This sentence works as both an observation and a quiet warning about how the mind often protects itself. Instead of pausing to listen honestly to what is happening internally, the ego frequently chooses the easier path of more action. More control, more forcing, more pushing life toward a direction the ego has already decided upon in advance. This creates a temporary feeling of being proactive, engaged, and firmly in charge of one's own circumstances. Yet underneath that feeling, it is often simply a subtle way of avoiding a much deeper and more uncomfortable truth. Let me tell you about a woman named Sophia, someone many people recognize instantly once her story unfolds clearly. Everyone around Sophia saw her as remarkably energetic, endlessly driven, and constantly moving towards some new accomplishment. Sophia always had a plan ready for absolutely everything happening in her life at any given moment. If work grew difficult, she would immediately set a fresh goal to focus her attention elsewhere entirely. If life started feeling slightly empty, she would sign up for a course, book a trip, or launch an entirely new project. Her calendar remained perpetually full, leaving almost no visible gaps anywhere throughout an ordinary week. But one evening, during an unusually long and honest conversation, Sophia admitted something she had never told anyone before that moment. She confessed that empty moments frightened her more than she had ever consciously realized until then. Whenever nothing filled her schedule, a vague uneasiness would rise inside her almost immediately without warning. To avoid that uncomfortable feeling, she would quickly search for something new to occupy her attention completely. Sophia's story reflects something far more common than most people initially assume when they first hear it described. Many of us stay constantly busy not because busyness is genuinely required, but because it makes us feel secure and safe. The ego believes that stopping means everything will collapse immediately without constant maintenance and effort applied. So it pushes a person to keep moving forward, keep acting, keep attempting to control every outcome possible. But life, according to Jung's framework, does not operate entirely according to the logic the ego prefers to follow. There are periods when constant action does not bring a person closer to their true path at all. In fact, that same constant motion may actually pull someone further away from where they genuinely need to be heading. Imagine, for a moment, that the human soul resembles a deep, quiet lake sitting beneath an open sky. When the surface of that water is constantly disturbed, seeing clearly down to its bottom becomes completely impossible. The harder someone stirs the water, the murkier and more clouded it becomes with every passing moment. Only when the surface finally settles into stillness can a person begin to glimpse what actually rests beneath it. The human mind functions in a strikingly similar way whenever anxiety, fear, or a desire for control drives constant action forward. When we act primarily from these places, we make the surface of our inner world chaotic and difficult to read clearly. In that agitated state, hearing the subtle signals rising from within becomes remarkably difficult, no matter how hard someone tries. Jung believed firmly that the human soul is never simply a rational machine operating on logic alone. Beneath ordinary consciousness exists a deeper layer of the psyche, a place containing intuition, symbols, and a form of wisdom the ego cannot fully command. Many spiritual traditions across different cultures give this deeper layer different names depending on their particular beliefs and practices. Yet, in the lived experience of countless people, this is also the place where many sense the quiet presence of something larger. Some call this divine guidance, a deeper form of direction that the ego simply cannot force or command into existence. When the ego rushes into action too quickly and too often, it frequently ignores the signals rising steadily from this deeper layer within. Because of this pattern, many people feel busy with countless tasks yet somehow still empty inside at the same time. They keep moving forward relentlessly, yet often have very little clarity about where exactly they are actually heading. This creates a painful paradox that many people eventually recognize only after years of constant, exhausting motion. The paradox reveals itself clearly once people stop treating action as a shield protecting them from deeper self-examination. When someone no longer needs to rush into action simply to quiet the ego's constant demand for control, something shifts noticeably. Real safety, it turns out, does not come from controlling every single outcome in life with rigid precision. Real safety comes instead from the simple, difficult ability to listen honestly to oneself without immediately reacting or fixing. When people stop confusing constant action with genuine safety, they begin recognizing something entirely different about how life actually works. Calmness, patient listening, and radical honesty with oneself become the true foundation for making genuinely wise decisions going forward. From that place of stillness, rather than constant forced motion, a deeper sense of direction slowly begins revealing itself naturally. This path is not something forced into existence by the ego's rigid demands and constant anxious pushing. Instead, it gradually emerges through the quiet, patient guidance offered by a much deeper layer of the soul itself. This does not mean effort and ambition have no place in a meaningful, well-lived human life at all. It simply means that not every problem requires more forceful action thrown directly at it immediately without pause. Sometimes what a situation genuinely requires is not trying harder, but pausing long enough to understand why we feel compelled to try at all. This distinction matters enormously, because it changes the entire relationship a person has with difficulty, uncertainty, and unresolved tension in their life. Instead of viewing every uncomfortable feeling as a problem demanding immediate action, a person can learn to sit with it briefly first. This brief pause, uncomfortable as it initially feels, often reveals information that constant rushing would have completely missed entirely. Consider how Sophia's constant busyness never actually addressed the uneasy feeling that empty moments brought rising to her surface. Her projects, courses, and endless plans functioned more like distractions than genuine solutions to whatever discomfort sat quietly underneath them. Only by finally naming that discomfort honestly, during one unusually quiet evening conversation, did she begin understanding herself more clearly. This moment of honesty did not require her to abandon ambition or stop pursuing meaningful goals altogether in her life. It simply required her to notice the difference between action taken from genuine purpose and action taken purely from anxious avoidance. This distinction, once recognized clearly, becomes something a person can return to again and again throughout their life. The deeper lesson embedded within this entire pattern is remarkably simple once stated plainly and directly. Life does not always require more action, more effort, or more forceful control over every single outcome imaginable. Sometimes the wisest, most courageous choice available is simply pausing long enough to understand the impulse driving constant motion forward. When people finally stop confusing action with safety, an entirely different foundation for decision-making begins quietly forming inside them. This foundation rests on honesty, patience, and a willingness to listen rather than immediately react to every uncomfortable feeling. And from that quiet, honest foundation, a deeper and more authentic direction for life gradually begins revealing itself over time. Not a path forced violently into existence by an anxious, controlling ego demanding constant certainty and safety, but a path that slowly emerges through the patient, quiet guidance offered by something deeper than the ego could ever access alone. After a person begins recognizing that constant action rarely brings the clarity they were searching for, they often enter a different kind of experience altogether. This new phase feels quieter on the surface, yet it can feel far more confusing and difficult to fully understand at first. It is the moment when everything in life seems to suddenly stop flowing smoothly the way it once did before. Plans that once moved forward with steady progress begin slowing down without any clear or obvious reason attached. Work that once felt manageable now feels unusually heavy, even though nothing about the actual tasks has changed. Efforts that once produced visible results now seem to accomplish very little, no matter how much energy gets poured into them. Many people describe this strange sensation as trying to row a boat across a river that has quietly run completely dry. There is a helpful literary image that captures this experience with unusual clarity, even though it comes from a story written long ago. In the novel The Old Man and the Sea, the fisherman Santiago faces many days without catching a single fish at all. Other fishermen around him begin whispering that his luck has finally run out after so many years of skill. Yet Santiago does not panic, and he does not desperately throw his nets in every direction out of pure frustration. He understands something important about the ocean that many people forget when facing their own dry periods in life. Some days the sea offers abundance freely, and other days the ocean simply remains silent no matter what anyone does. A fisherman cannot force the ocean to hand over fish through sheer willpower or frustrated effort alone. What matters most in this story is not that Santiago catches nothing during those difficult days at sea. What matters is how calmly and patiently he responds to that silence instead of fighting against it directly. The inner life of most people operates according to a remarkably similar rhythm, whether they consciously recognize this pattern or not. There are periods when everything flows naturally, when effort produces results, and when opportunities seem to appear almost effortlessly. But there are also periods when that natural flow suddenly slows down, quietly and without any obvious warning beforehand. When this happens, the ego often misunderstands the situation completely and assumes harder effort will fix everything immediately. In Jungian psychology, human life is never governed solely by willpower, rigid planning, or forceful determination alone. Beneath ordinary consciousness exists a deeper center of the psyche, holding intuition, meaning, and each person's true developmental direction. When someone moves closer to that authentic path, energy tends to appear naturally, almost without needing to be forced or manufactured. People feel genuine interest, real motivation, and a clear sense that they are moving in the correct direction for their life. But when the ego tries forcing life toward a direction that no longer truly fits a person, something specific happens. The very first thing that usually disappears is not opportunity or circumstance, but energy itself, quietly and gradually. Carl Jung once wrote a sentence worth sitting with carefully, since it captures something profound about forced effort versus genuine flow. He said that where love rules, there is no will to power, and where power dominates, love is lacking. This withdrawal of energy rarely happens suddenly or dramatically in most people's actual lived experience. It begins subtly, almost invisibly, with a little fatigue here and a small loss of enthusiasm appearing there gradually. Slowly, everything in life begins feeling heavier than it once did, even though the person is still doing exactly the same things. To understand this pattern more clearly, imagine trying to grow a tree in soil that simply does not suit its needs. You water it more frequently, add extra fertilizer, and tend to it with even greater care and attention than before. Yet the tree continues growing weakly, not because your care was somehow incorrect or insufficient in any obvious way. It grows weakly because that particular soil was never truly meant to support that specific kind of tree at all. When the same tree gets moved into more suitable ground, It often begins growing almost effortlessly and naturally without excessive intervention needed. No forcing, no excessive effort required, only the right environment finally matching what the tree actually needed all along. Human psychological energy functions according to this exact same underlying principle, whether people recognize this pattern clearly or not. When someone moves in the genuine direction of their own development, energy naturally appears to support that movement forward. But when a person forces themselves along a path that no longer truly belongs to who they are, that energy gradually begins withdrawing. What confuses many people during this experience is believing they simply need to try harder to fix the problem. What is actually necessary, more often than not, is learning to stop and reconsider the direction entirely instead. In modern daily life, countless people experience this exact state without ever fully recognizing what is actually happening to them. They work hard, set numerous goals, and constantly push themselves forward toward achievement and visible success. Yet internally, they feel tired, hollow, and strangely disconnected from whatever they are actually working so hard to accomplish. This happens not because these people are weak, undisciplined, or somehow lacking in genuine determination and effort. It happens because their flow of energy is quietly moving toward a direction that no longer authentically belongs to them anymore. From Jung's broader perspective, when the soul withdraws its energy from a particular path, it is not doing this to punish anyone deliberately. It withdraws energy specifically to prevent a person from continuing much further down a path that leads away from who they truly are. If energy continued flowing steadily into that mismatched path, a person might travel remarkably far before ever realizing they had lost their genuine direction. But when energy withdraws noticeably, the ego is essentially forced to slow down and seriously reconsider its current direction and choices. For many people, these slower, more difficult periods also become moments when they begin sensing something deeper operating quietly within their life. Many spiritual traditions describe this deeper operating force as God, though not as something demanding life unfold exactly according to personal wishes. Instead, this guidance appears as a quiet presence that often reveals itself precisely during the moments that force genuine pause and reflection. Periods when life suddenly becomes noticeably slower often carry a much deeper meaning than most people initially realize or accept. They function almost like a silent internal signal, quietly asking a person to seriously reconsider their current direction and choices. When someone finally stops forcing everything to continue exactly as it did before, they begin noticing things previously invisible to them. Their true desires, their deeper personal values, and sometimes an entirely different path they had never seriously considered before. Therefore, when a person enters a phase where everything in life seems to stop flowing naturally, panic is rarely the correct response. What actually helps during these periods is simply slowing down long enough to honestly observe where personal energy feels genuinely alive, and where, by contrast, that same energy seems to be steadily and quietly draining away without any clear explanation. Sometimes this simple act of honest listening opens up an entirely new direction that a person could not previously perceive clearly. If you have ever experienced a period in your own life when everything suddenly seemed to slow down in this exact way, consider leaving a comment below. Simply writing the words "I've been there" can remind other people watching that this exact experience is far more universal than it initially feels. Sometimes just a few simple, honest words are enough to remind us that countless other people are quietly walking through this same difficult journey right alongside us. These slower, more difficult periods are rarely punishments handed down arbitrarily by some indifferent universe with no deeper purpose or meaning attached. They are, more often than not, gentle but persistent signals asking a person to seriously reconsider whether their current direction still genuinely fits who they truly are becoming. And if these gentle signals continue being ignored for too long without any honest reflection or meaningful change, something important eventually happens next. The unconscious, unable to communicate effectively through subtle signals alone anymore, is often forced to begin speaking through much louder and far more difficult means instead. Number 3, when ignored signals force a collapse. The moment when life's flow begins slowing down rarely appears suddenly, right before everything truly grinds to a halt completely. Life usually sends many smaller signals first, quiet warnings that arrive gently before anything more disruptive ever happens. The real problem is that most people either fail to notice these signals or notice them and choose to ignore them anyway. And when these subtle signals go consistently unheard, the unconscious is eventually forced to use much stronger methods to make a person stop. From Carl Jung's perspective, the human psyche always seeks to preserve a kind of internal balance, even when the ego resists this process. When the ego pulls life too far away from a person's true path, the unconscious begins sending increasingly noticeable signs. At first, these signs remain gentle, appearing as unexplained fatigue, a quiet loss of interest, or a vague discomfort surrounding certain choices. But because the ego always wants to maintain firm control over circumstances, it typically explains these signals in the simplest way possible. It tells itself that trying harder will fix whatever discomfort has quietly appeared, rather than considering a different direction entirely. Jung once wrote a widely known sentence worth remembering carefully here, since it captures this exact pattern precisely. He said that one does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious instead. What Jung meant is that uncomfortable inner signals will not simply disappear if a person refuses to face them honestly. On the contrary, these signals tend to grow stronger and more insistent the longer they continue being ignored or dismissed. A viewer once left a comment beneath one of our earlier videos that has stayed with many people who read it afterward. They shared that they had worked the same job for 8 full years, feeling increasingly heavy every single morning for the final 2 years. At first, they assumed this heaviness was simply ordinary tiredness, so they responded by trying to work even harder. Eventually, their body began reacting more directly, bringing sleeplessness, frequent headaches, and physical exhaustion that could no longer be ignored. They eventually had to leave that job entirely due to complete burnout, forced to stop by their own body rather than choice. Looking back afterward, they realized they had known for a long time that the job no longer truly suited who they had become. This story is far from rare, and countless people experience remarkably similar signals without ever recognizing their deeper meaning clearly. From Jung's perspective, symptoms like these are sometimes not enemies working against a person's well-being at all. They function instead like a language spoken by the unconscious, especially when gentler methods of communication have already failed repeatedly. When the soul cannot reach the ego through intuition or subtle emotional signals, it eventually resorts to much stronger signals instead. An easy way to picture this clearly is imagining the dashboard warning light inside an ordinary car during everyday driving. When an engine develops a problem, the car does not stop immediately without any warning given beforehand to the driver. First, a small warning light appears, offering the driver a chance to stop and check what might be wrong. If the driver notices this light and responds appropriately, the problem often gets addressed before it becomes something far more serious. But if the driver continues ignoring that warning light and keeps driving exactly as before, small problems eventually escalate significantly. The human soul operates according to this same basic pattern, beginning with mild discomfort before eventually growing into something much larger. What starts as simple unease can gradually become prolonged exhaustion, and eventually larger disruptions like burnout or sudden unexpected life changes. Jung recognized clearly that the unconscious always attempts to guide a person gently back toward their authentic developmental path over time. But the ego frequently clings tightly to familiar circumstances, since change feels frightening and uncertain compared to staying exactly the same. This is precisely why the ego often ignores the earliest, gentlest signals the soul attempts to communicate through. And when this pattern continues long enough without any honest acknowledgement, the unconscious inevitably must speak through much louder means instead. This explains why many people only experience genuine change after some major disruptive event forces their hand completely. It might arrive as a serious crisis at work, the sudden collapse of an important relationship, or overwhelming and undeniable exhaustion. Looking back afterward, most people eventually realize that warning signs had actually appeared long before that major disruptive event occurred. But because they stayed too busy, too distracted, or too frightened to listen carefully, those earlier signals went completely unheard. There exists a helpful ancient symbol capturing this entire process with remarkable clarity, even though it originates from mythology written centuries ago. Consider the widespread story of the phoenix, found across many different cultures throughout human history in various forms. In these traditional stories, The phoenix does not experience a simple, gentle rebirth without any real cost attached to the process. Before any new cycle of life can genuinely begin, the phoenix must first pass through a complete and total burning. Fire consumes its entire old body until nothing remains except ashes scattered quietly across the ground below. Yet from those very ashes, a completely new bird eventually emerges, stronger and renewed in ways the old form never was. For ancient storytellers, this myth never represented simple tragedy or meaningless destruction happening without any deeper purpose attached. It represented transformation instead, the idea that certain stages of life can only end through complete and total dissolution first. Only after this dissolution occurs can something genuinely new have the necessary space required to properly emerge afterward. This pattern of necessary dismantling before genuine growth appears not only within mythology, but also within modern scientific research as well. In neuroscience specifically, when a person changes how they think or successfully learns something entirely new, their brain must physically reorganize itself. Old neural connections gradually weaken and lose strength, allowing entirely new connections to properly form and eventually strengthen over time. From a purely scientific perspective, meaningful development rarely happens without some genuine dismantling of previous, outdated internal structures first occurring. Human psychological life appears to operate according to this exact same underlying principle, whether people consciously recognize this pattern or not. When the ego constructs an entire life around beliefs or goals that no longer authentically fit a person's deeper nature, that structure eventually cracks. A job that once brought genuine satisfaction suddenly feels strangely empty and unfulfilling despite nothing about the actual work changing. A relationship that once occupied the very center of someone's life gradually becomes a persistent source of quiet tension instead. A plan once trusted completely no longer carries the same weight or meaning it previously held for that same person. On the surface, moments exactly like these often look identical to failure, disappointment, or unwanted loss without any deeper purpose attached. But looking more carefully beneath the surface, these moments may actually represent signs that something deeper is quietly adjusting a person's overall direction. Jung referred to this ongoing process as part of individuation, the lifelong journey of gradually becoming who someone truly and authentically is. Within this journey, the ego frequently proves to be an unreliable guide, since it clings tightly to familiar images of self-identity. Sometimes the ego must release these old self-images entirely before a person can clearly see what they genuinely need to become instead. An easy way to picture this process involves imagining the experience of rebuilding a house with a badly cracked foundation underneath it. If a building's foundation has already begun cracking significantly, simply repainting the walls will never solve the underlying structural problem at all. Sooner or later, that entire structure becomes genuinely dangerous, regardless of how attractive the surface appearance might temporarily remain. In situations exactly like this, building something genuinely stronger requires dismantling the old structure completely before beginning construction again from the foundation upward. From the ego's limited perspective, this entire process looks remarkably similar to pure destruction without any redeeming value whatsoever. But viewed instead from the broader perspective of genuine development, this same process represents necessary and valuable preparation for what comes next. Many people, after eventually looking back on this entire dismantling process from a distance, begin feeling that none of it was purely random after all. It feels instead as though something deeper quietly guided their life by carefully removing paths that no longer genuinely belonged to who they were becoming. This removal opens space for an entirely different, deeper direction that they simply could not perceive clearly beforehand. It is precisely during these seemingly chaotic, difficult periods that many people begin recognizing things they had genuinely never noticed before in their lives. Their true underlying values, their deeper personal desires, and sometimes an entirely different life path they had never seriously considered pursuing. Losing a job unexpectedly sometimes leads a person toward discovering far more meaningful work they never previously considered as a realistic possibility. The sudden ending of a relationship sometimes forces someone to understand themselves far more deeply than they ever had before that painful ending occurred. The failure of a carefully constructed plan sometimes pushes a person toward finally living according to what they authentically believe rather than simply following expectations. Collapse, therefore, does not always represent a true ending in the way most people initially assume when experiencing it directly. Very often, collapse simply represents the difficult transition occurring between two genuinely different stages of an ongoing human life. Just as a seed must fully break open before any new sprout can properly emerge from within it, certain life structures similarly need to dissolve before something entirely new can begin growing in their place. If you have ever experienced a moment when an important part of your own life suddenly and unexpectedly collapsed completely, take a moment right now to remember it clearly. Perhaps it was a job, a meaningful relationship, or a major plan you had trusted completely before it fell apart. If you feel comfortable sharing that experience, consider leaving your story in the comments section directly below this video for others to read. Sometimes sharing this kind of difficult journey does more than simply help other people realize they are genuinely not alone in experiencing something similar. It also helps you personally recognize the deeper meaning embedded within whatever difficult path you have already walked through completely. After an old path collapses, and a person is forced to release plans they once believed were certain, life sometimes begins revealing very subtle signs. Not grand miracles or clear, obvious answers, but small coincidences appearing exactly when they are needed most. An unexpected meeting, a piece of information heard by pure chance, an opportunity appearing just as every door seemed to have closed completely. In these moments, many people begin sensing that life itself is quietly trying to communicate something meaningful to them directly. Carl Jung called this phenomenon synchronicity, meaning a coincidence that carries genuine significance rather than pure randomness alone. It occurs when two events happen at the same time without any clear causal relationship, yet still carry profound personal meaning. Jung once wrote that synchronicity is an ever-present reality for those who have eyes to see it clearly. Meaningful coincidence always exists quietly within life, though only those paying close attention ever manage to recognize it happening. Moments like these often appear during very ordinary situations that most people would otherwise dismiss without a second thought. Have you ever thought about someone you had not spoken to in years, only to have them text you at that exact moment? Or perhaps you were quietly reflecting on an important decision, and suddenly overheard a conversation or read a passage speaking directly to that same question. Taken individually, these events look like simple coincidence, nothing more than ordinary randomness occurring without any deeper significance attached. But when they occur during genuinely important moments in someone's life, they begin feeling entirely different, almost as though meaning were being delivered directly. According to Jung, coincidences like these reflect a deeper connection between a person's inner world and the events unfolding around them externally. When someone begins changing internally, releasing an old path, an old belief, or an outdated image of themselves, the world sometimes rearranges itself subtly. Events that once seemed completely unrelated begin connecting naturally, almost like scattered puzzle pieces slowly forming a larger, more coherent picture. Imagine walking along a road completely covered in thick fog, unable to see anything beyond just a few steps directly ahead. Yet each time you continue walking forward, the next small section of road gradually becomes visible before you. Often, looking back after a long journey, a person realizes that the most important turns appeared exactly when they were ready. Human life frequently unfolds according to this exact same pattern, though it rarely feels this clear while actually living through it. Viewed only through the narrow lens of the ego, events appear scattered, random, and genuinely difficult to understand or connect meaningfully. But looking back years later, certain encounters, opportunities, and pivotal moments often appear in remarkably precise and well-timed ways. For some people, this pattern simply represents good fortune, nothing more than statistical luck occurring naturally over a long enough period. But for others, it represents something deeper, the quiet way many traditions describe God guiding human beings through ordinary daily circumstances. What makes this guidance remarkable is that it rarely arrives as clear, direct instructions telling someone exactly what to do next. Instead, it appears through a series of small signs, one door closing so an old path cannot continue any further. An opportunity appearing precisely when someone finally becomes ready to step into an entirely new stage of life. A person entering someone's life unexpectedly and quietly changing the way they see the world around them completely. According to Jung's framework, moments like these tend to occur most often when someone begins living closer to their deeper center, what he called the self. When the ego finally stops trying to rigidly control every single outcome, people naturally become more sensitive to these subtle signals arriving around them. The important lesson here is not searching desperately for hidden meaning inside every single coincidence that happens throughout an ordinary day. The important lesson is learning to notice genuinely meaningful moments when they arrive, without forcing significance onto events that simply lack any. When people finally stop forcing every outcome to match the ego's rigid plans, they begin realizing something quietly important. Life always contains gentle ways of pointing someone toward a new direction, even when that direction remains initially unclear. Sometimes this guidance arrives through an unexpected opportunity appearing exactly when it feels most needed and most impossible to ignore. Sometimes it arrives through a seemingly random meeting that later reveals itself as remarkably significant to someone's entire life direction. And sometimes it arrives through a small, quiet event allowing someone to finally see their own path in an entirely new light. The deeper meaning behind moments exactly like these reminds people that life is never shaped purely through personal effort and willpower alone. There exists another dimension to human experience that cannot be fully controlled, predicted, or forced into existence through sheer determination. When people learn to listen carefully to that deeper dimension, they begin realizing that life often speaks through circumstance rather than through words directly. When someone genuinely begins recognizing this pattern within their own life, the way they perceive everyday existence tends to shift significantly afterward. They no longer feel the constant pressure to force every single outcome into existence through relentless personal effort and control. Instead, they learn to walk through life with greater attention, patience, and quiet trust in something larger than themselves. Because sometimes what genuinely guides a person forward is not the exhausting effort of the ego pushing relentlessly against circumstances. It is instead the simple ability to recognize when a deeper guidance is quietly opening a new door within life's ordinary, everyday circumstances. It is here, after all the signs, the coincidences, and the unexpected doors that appear throughout life, that people begin to notice something even deeper. The clearest sign of moving in the right direction rarely lies in external circumstances alone, no matter how meaningful those circumstances may initially feel. It is not success, recognition, or visible results that can be measured or immediately celebrated by anyone watching from outside. The deepest sign often appears somewhere far quieter, within the inner state of a person's own soul instead. Carl Jung once wrote that the privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are, without exception or compromise. And when a person begins genuinely moving closer to that true self, a very subtle change usually starts appearing quietly within them. A sense of peace unlike anything they had experienced before, arriving not through effort, but through simple alignment with their own nature. During a Jungian therapy session, a man in his early 30s named Stephen once sat across from a therapist, appearing composed and outwardly successful. He was neatly dressed, spoke with clear confidence, and held a job that many people around him considered genuinely desirable and impressive. But as the conversation deepened, a quiet fatigue became visible in his eyes, something difficult to hide despite his composed exterior. Stephen explained that he had followed his current career path for nearly 10 years, and everything about it made logical sense externally. Yet inside, he always carried a quiet, persistent tension that never fully disappeared no matter how much success he achieved. What became remarkable was the shift in his voice the moment he began speaking about things he had once genuinely loved. Writing, studying psychology, and working closely with people, these topics slowed his speech and softened his entire presence noticeably. In that brief moment, he seemed to touch something real and authentic within himself that his career had quietly buried. From Jung's perspective, moments exactly like this carry enormous importance, since the soul rarely communicates through clear, direct commands. It communicates instead through inner states, subtle shifts in energy, tension, and ease that reveal far more than words ever could. When a person moves too far away from their true and authentic path, the psyche often becomes tense, disordered, and gradually drained of vital energy. But when someone begins moving closer to what genuinely suits their deeper nature, an entirely different feeling starts to emerge instead. Not intense excitement or dramatic emotion, but a deep, quiet sense of calmness settling steadily within them. An easy way to picture this clearly is imagining the simple experience of wearing a pair of shoes that fits absolutely perfectly. When shoes are the wrong size, every single step feels uncomfortable, even if a person continues walking forward regardless of the discomfort. But when shoes genuinely fit well, a person hardly thinks about them at all, simply walking naturally without any friction. Inner life operates according to this exact same principle, whether people consciously recognize this pattern within their own experience or not. When someone moves away from their authentic path, a subtle tension remains constantly present, quietly draining energy in the background. But when someone moves in the right direction for their own life, a natural sense of peace gradually begins appearing instead. What matters most here is understanding clearly that inner peace does not mean life suddenly becomes easy or free from genuine challenges entirely. A person's true path can still contain significant difficulty, uncertainty, and real challenges that require patience, courage, and sustained effort over time. But the internal experience of facing these challenges becomes completely different once someone moves closer to their authentic direction. Instead of feeling as though they must constantly struggle against life itself, they begin feeling as though they are moving together with a deeper current running through it. Many people, after looking back on their lives from a distance, eventually realize the clearest sign they were on the right path was never external results. It was, instead, the quiet internal change they experienced, becoming calmer, more grounded, and less consumed by the need to constantly prove something.